Hi all, welcome back. Today we're going to continue our discussion of the West, but today from an opposing point of view. So where in the last lesson we were looking at white Americans and their journey westward from the 1860s through the early 1900s, what motivated that migration, what were the consequences of it, what were the positives and negatives. Well, that was a perspective about the US government and this idea of manifest destiny. Now let's look at the people who inhabited that space long before there was white American settlement. So the indigenous people, the native peoples of the West. And what we want to do is start by kind of coming back to some of the same concepts we were looking at in our previous lesson, which is what's motivating all this westward expansion, right? We've talked about manifest destiny before. We've talked about this idea that there was opportunity if one could go west. And we focused a lot on farming in the last lesson, but it's important to know that in the West, starting with the discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill in 1849, we see a series of gold and silver strikes over the next 50 years that are going to encourage more and more white settlement in the West. There were great riches to be found in both gold and silver deposits, and many of these discoveries are actually going to shape the US government's policies with the native people who inhabited these lands before gold and silver was found there. So the people of the far west, if we go back and we look at Eastern Native peoples, we spoke about Indian removal during the Jackson period. The 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, the Seminole, the Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Creek, those groups that were seen as having adopted some Western ways and had very large settlements east of the Mississippi, who by 1830, Congress had agreed would be removed to a reservation in what we call Oklahoma today. That Oklahoma territory, we'll see in this lesson as well, will change during this period. But the migration, that forced migration of Eastern Indian tribal groups, that was really just speaking about native people east of the Mississippi. There were probably somewhere in the ballpark of about 500,000 indigenous peoples living west of the Mississippi at that time, but ultimately were removed from conflicts with white settlement because for the most part there wasn't white settlement. The largest of these groups will be the Plains Indians. These were the nomadic peoples, primarily focused on buffalo hunting across the Great Plains of the western region of the United States. The 2 largest groups being the Sioux Nation and the Cheyenne. We'll also see some smaller tribal groups of the far west, particularly the far southwest, the Navajo and the Apache, as well as the Pueblo. And all of those groups were in much smaller numbers. They were typically peoples that had a pronounced period of time of settlement, had hunting, but it was annual, not so much of the nomadic movement that we see among the tribal peoples of the plains. But these groups of people, particularly of the West, had lived basically away from white settlement for hundreds of years. The Pueblo, as we studied back in units 1 and 2, had dealt with the Spanish and their search to create further and further colonies north in what was Mexico of the time. But by 1680, essentially Spanish settlement had pulled back because of things like the Pueblo Revolt. There was some Spanish mission settlement along the West Coast, but for the most part, there was not white Western settlement. Particularly groups like the Sioux Nation and the Cheyenne continued to grow in size, particularly once they adopted the horse in the early 1600s. So just to give you a sense of where these people would be living circa 1875. And then reservations later on. So we're going to talk more and more about the reservation system. We spoke about the Oklahoma Territory reservations that came into being starting in the 1830s. And where we see yellow on our screen here, these were reservations that existed as of 1875. Where we see this red, or we see these lines, these reddish lines through these yellowed areas, this is where the U.S. government stipulates is native land as of 1900. So you can see that even in just the last quarter of the 19th century, the amount of land that the United States government was willing to cede to native people will decrease over time. Another way of looking at it is, well, what was considered native land and what was considered land that had permanent American settlement? In 1850, you can see that for the most part, you have in all of these lands west of the Mississippi, pretty significant native settlement. Obviously, within 15 years, California, right, partly motivated by that gold rush in 1849 and statehood in 1850, increased settlement. You'll see more people who coming across that Oregon Trail to settle in what will be Oregon and Washington State in that same time period. There'll be other areas where gold will be found, including Montana and what we call Idaho today, and also in the Utah and Colorado areas as well. And so that's part of the reason why we see significant white settlement coming in at the eve of the Civil War. By 1880, which will be 10 years after the completion of the first line, the Transcontinental Railroad, and its subsequent lines, you will see that white settlement is quite prolific by 1880. And certainly by 1900, there is very little land, as there was in 1850, that is going to be seen as native or belonging to any kind of tribal group. You will see attacks on the part of native people against whites who attempt to settle and travel west, and vice versa. There was very little military control or presence in the West prior to the Civil War. After the Civil War, there'll be a significant number of federal troops that will be placed in the West, primarily for controlling the native peoples that lived there. The first major conflict between the U.S. military and native people west of the Mississippi will be in Sand Creek in Colorado in 1864, what becomes known as the Sand Creek Massacre. The Cheyenne and Arapaho nations had traveled for more than 200 years across what is now Colorado, Wyoming, as a part of their hunting grounds. That's where the buffalo grazed, and they hunted the buffalo. There will be the beginnings of reservations starting in the 1850s in that area, simply because gold will be discovered in and around what is the Boulder area today. The Cheyenne and the Arapaho will attempt to create a truce with the Colorado territorial government in 1864. They don't want to be fighting directly against the U.S. military, but they also want to be able to continue to be a nomadic people and to hunt and live as they have for centuries. In the course of what was supposed to be a ceasefire, where the larger adult male population had gone off to hunt, a group of U.S. soldiers attacked and killed more than 130 Native women and children and old men who were not available for fighting and hunting. That Sand Creek Massacre for other tribal groups will begin a phase in which the U.S. government is seen as suspect, and that there will actually be, by some Native groups, out-and-out resistance against white settlement in the West. Other groups will be seeking to develop treaties and some type of reservation system in order to keep some land and not lose everything due to conflict and warfare. So the white perspective, as we talked about in the earlier class, was that there was virgin land. This was to be tamed. It was waiting for them. This is what God had given the American people. This was their opportunity. The idea that there was native presence, even if it was only temporary presence, groups like the Sioux in particular, they followed the buffalo herds. They might spend only a few weeks in some areas before moving on. But the fact that there was this presence was something that white settlers in particular did not want to experience, and thought that the US government had a responsibility to contain or remove Native people, because the government had already done that in the East, so why would it not do that again in the West? Because of events like Sand Creek, the US government created something called the Indian Peace Commission. And the idea was that it would seek out permanent areas for Native groups, a system of reservations. So they continued to add on and create more reservations with what was available land in the Oklahoma Territory, and also began to create a series of reservations in the Dakotas. Their goal was that there would be no more individual tribal treaties, but there would just be one Native American policy established by the government for all Native groups. And it came with some expectations. And the biggest one of that was that there would be permanent settlement. So even where there might be tens of thousands of acres set aside for an Indian reservation, Native peoples were not to go outside of those boundaries. For the Native Plains Indians, they hunted the buffalo. The buffalo's hide made their tents, made their clothing. They used the bones. They used all of the animal. And certainly the meat provided nutrition. They could survive in the large numbers that they grew to because there were plenty of buffalo. However, between 1865 and 1885, very quickly, the buffalo population would be decimated because of the Transcontinental Railroad. Buffalo in their natural state, often you would find herds of thousands that roamed the Great Plains. They survive in cold temperatures. They are large animals, on average weighing more than 1,000 pounds fully grown. They were a great resource and the most vital resource to the Native peoples of the plains. That population, as you can see, will begin to drop precipitously in the 1870s, in part because that is also when we begin to see the completion of the first line of the Transcontinental Railroad. The railroad companies paid people to actually ride the trains to shoot buffalo. There became a fad for buffalo clothing and using the hides for other purposes. And also, a herd of buffalo could easily derail the locomotives of the day. And so the buffalo were also seen as a hazard to people who were traveling west. This is a pile of bones. So just to give you a sense of the huge decimation, by 1900, the buffalo were essentially a near extinct species. They've come back in much larger numbers in the 20th and 21st century, but a lot of that has to do with the government and private individuals who've attempted to increase that species size once again. So the contestation over land between Native people and the US government begins with a series of treaties. The first one created in 1851, just 2 years after that gold discovery in California. And then the second one in 1868, which followed gold discovery in South Dakota. The Plains Indians were seen to be needing defined territory. That if they were going to survive, they were going to survive by not having to contest with whites for land. All of this, however, will very quickly be undermined because there will be continued exploration and discovery of gold and silver in these Western territories. And every time a new gold strike or silver strike took place, you see Native people in the treaties that they had signed at an earlier time being overturned. These treaties have come up in court over the latter part of the 20th century and including the beginning of the 21st century. And many of them have actually now been ruled in favor of Native people. Not that they get their land returned to them, but they get the monetary value in most cases of that land. In 1876, so that would have been the centennial, right, 100 years after the writing of the Declaration of Independence. In that first week of July of 1876, there will be the largest battle to date between the Plains Indians, primarily the Sioux Nation, against the U.S. military. It's something called the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Little Bighorn is a river in Montana. And the Sioux Nation divided by the 1870s between those who said we should live upon the land that has been agreed upon by treaty, and those which were primarily of the younger group and males within the tribe who believed that if they could not move beyond the reservation system, their people would not survive because their way of life was so dependent upon the buffalo. In July of 1876, the U.S. government felt that there could be a military presence that would be possible in stopping what were groups like the Sioux who were refusing to stay contained on the reservation. In particular, particularly in the summer and early fall months, you would have groups of Sioux who would leave their reservation in South Dakota and pursue buffalo in places like Montana and Idaho and Colorado. In order to try to prevent this and push these Native people back onto the reservation system, the United States government decided to send what was their elite military force of the day, a group known as the 7th Cavalry, that had established itself during the time of the Civil War. As being kind of similar to what we'd see sort of Navy SEALs or Green Berets, special forces today. Cavalry troops were highly trained. They could fight on horseback. They could live off the land for prolonged periods of time. And they typically were very brave soldiers who could face firing from guns head on. Under the command of a man named General Armstrong Custer, they went out and decided that they were going to be stopping what was this desire by the Sioux to move beyond the boundaries of their reservation. Custer had been a hero during the Civil War at Gettysburg. He was someone who had been a general in rank during the Civil War, but due to sometimes his foolhardiness, he'd been reduced in rank to a mere colonel by 1876. But his elite force was sent out to stop the Sioux with the belief that 264 men would be able to stop what they believed to be about 500 Sioux Indians. In fact, they will meet with more than 2,000 Native people. They had very little understanding of the topography that was used against them. And George Custer and all of his men will be killed. And if you think about it, the 100th anniversary of our nation would have been a time of great celebration, parades, right? And the news that the nation heard on July 4th of 1876 was that the U.S. government, the U.S. military had been defeated by a people that were seen as inferior. And unfortunately, because of those events, much of the American public began to see particularly the Sioux Nation as a group of people who were to be feared and to be overcome. The Sioux were forced back into their reservations, and we will see from 1876 to 1890 a concerted effort by the U.S. government to further confine the Plains Indians to the system of reservations. Very few people, in the same way that we saw in the Jacksonian era, very few people ever spoke out against the reservation system. For many people, they saw that as a benevolence, that Native people were being given something when they didn't have to be. They could have simply been annihilated. However, there were some people who felt that the US government had been in the wrong, that they had a system of policies going all the way back to the 1790s that demonstrated that they weren't honest brokers, that they were looking to always limit the land that Native people could live upon, and did things, signed treaties that they never honored. The most famous example of that kind of work is something known as a Century of Dishonor. Helen Hunt Jackson was primarily a fiction writer, but by the late 1870s, she, through friendships, other people she knew, began to learn more and more about the plight of Native people in the West, and decided that she wanted to do research. She wanted to have evidence. She wanted to present to the American public what really was Native American policy. She posed as a journalist who was interested in reporting on the good work that the Bureau of Indian Affairs did. And she spent a good part of a year researching in their archive, and as a result published a book called A Century of Dishonor. And going all the way back to the Treaty of Greenville in 1795, she was able to show documented evidence that the US government, for the most part, signed treaties with Native people, and whether that was to lease land and eventually just stop making payments on it, or essentially renegotiating treaties where land had been ceded at one point and then redefining those boundaries, that was essentially how the US government had always operated with Native people. This book, unfortunately, was not well received. The vast majority of the American public found it hard to believe some of the things that she said had happened. People felt that many of these Native groups were inferior. They needed to adopt white Western ways that they were to survive. And so this book really didn't have the effect that she hoped it would. But certainly in the 1960s and 1970s, this book was, by that time, able to demonstrate that there had been really a concerted effort on the part of the United States government to limit, and in some cases, essentially annihilate Native peoples for much of its early history. Due to warfare, large numbers of Native people in the plains who were starving by the late 1880s due to the lack of buffalo. The US government will begin to create what they consider a new era of Native policies. And we'll begin with something called the Dawes Severalty Act. And the word severalty there is a legal term meaning to separate. Senator Dawes, who helped initiate this legislation, was from a group of people who felt that Native people were worthy of being saved, but only would be on the terms of the white population of the day. And therefore, what was indigenous culture had to be broken. It had to be changed. And what we begin to see is that in many cases it was well-meaning, but ultimately and effectively it was a cultural genocide. So the Dawes Act of 1887 ends tribal ownership. So from the time of the US Constitution, we know that there's this idea that Native peoples are nations that live within the larger sovereign nation of the United States. Until 1887, they owned land as a tribal group, not as individuals. However, whites living in the United States function on a very individual basis, right? If you think about just our Bill of Rights, right, are designed to protect the rights of the individual, property ownership, competition in the marketplace. These were the white American values of the day. And so the Dawes Act sought to replicate those values wherever possible for Native people in the West. So as an individual, you could get 80 acres, or a Native family could get 160 acres, but that was the allotment that one would have gotten with the Homestead Act. This land was meant to be farmed. And so, for example, the Sioux Nation, the land that they occupied in South Dakota, was divided up, and literally that land and title to it, or potential title to it, was given to each male adult or each head of family in order to be productive. In order to get the full title to your land, you had to make it productive for 25 years. If you remember with the Homestead Act, there was a 5-year requirement for productivity. The vast majority of Native people will never gain full title to their land. It applied to all the tribal groups except the Pueblo, who were already living in a similar fashion in their reservations in the West. And the main goal was assimilation. So not only are we going to be individuals and we're going to have an individual relationship with the government and we're going to be individually productive, not collectively, we're also going to see the beginnings of reservations where the government mandated things like Christian church attendance, formal schooling for children, and preventing rituals. One of which that became very popular in the 1870s and 1880s was called the ghost dance. And the idea behind it was that this ritual could, in effect, bring back the dead ancestors of the Native people to help them overcome white presence and regain their land. And obviously, doing the ghost dance didn't achieve that, but it was something that was seen as antagonistic by the US government and prohibited. Chief Joseph, who will be a leader of one of the Plains Indian nations, wrote and spoke a lot about what it meant as a Native person to give up freedom, to concede to what were now the values that white Western settlement had put upon Native people. And ultimately, by 1890, there will be no more armed resistance by Native people against the US government. But it is one in which we will see that with the lack of resistance, we will see that there will also be essentially a destruction of culture. Along with the Dawes Act, you saw a lot of philanthropic groups that were created in the East based on the idea that Native people essentially needed white saviors. That if they, from an early age, could experience white culture, white Christian culture, that they then could become the saviors of their own people. Essentially, they were a species becoming extinct. The pictures that you see on my screen are from a place called the Carlisle Indian School, which existed for about 30 years. Boarding schools for Native children existed well into the early 1980s. Carlisle was one of the largest and most famous. And this school was created for the purposes of sending Native children away from their families, typically for an extended period of time. So one might arrive in Carlisle at age 7 and return back to their reservation at maybe age 16. And you can see from these pictures, these were actually used to raise money for this endeavor, but these were children as they arrived to the settlement, and then they were given clothing and haircuts and essentially anglicized. one of the terrible things that came out of this experience was that for most of these Native children, they never could go back and live on the reservations that they came from. That they were educated in ways that made them incredibly productive, that they could be college educated, they could run businesses, they had skills. Many of these were really industrial skills. So they taught carpentry and plumbing and all kinds of other important tasks. But these young people no longer had the language of their people. They had been removed from their families, in some cases for nearly a decade. And so when they returned, they found themselves in this purgatory. They were no longer native, but they also were not readily accepted by white culture for the most part. But it was based on this idea that one could kill the Indian and save the man, that the Indian culture itself had to be broken, and what could be resurrected through Western education was a better person. So we had talked during our Unit 4, and we looked at Indian removal with what was the Great Indian Reservation of the Oklahoma Territory. And that will stay in place for more than 60 years. But there were lands that were never assigned. And what that means is that the U.S. government, as it divided up and set aside space for the Cherokee and the Choctaw and the various other groups, had land that it did not assign. That land in 1898 will be broken up in much of the same way as the land was broken up with the Dawes Act. What's known as the Curtis Act basically did the Dawes Act in Oklahoma. Also, that unassigned land will be shared and passed on to white settlers. In 1889, the United States government will actually offer for relatively a nominal cost, in some cases outright free, that any white person who wished to settle, they literally lined people up on a specific date, fired a gun, and allowed people to move out across these unassigned lands. They were given a post to put in place with a number that marked their claim. They pulled out another post, turn in back to the government, honoring that claim. For people who tried to get ahead of the game, tried to do things to manipulate getting ahead in terms of the land, they were known as the Sooners. The people who waited their turn, followed the rules of the government, they were known as the Boomers. But if you know anything about Oklahoma football, there is a song about the Boomers and the Sooners to this day. But what will essentially initiate an era in which we begin to see a call for statehood for Oklahoma will begin with this land rush in 1889. By 1907, when Oklahoma does become a state, many of these assigned lands will be ruled to be unproductive. So the native groups that had gotten them back in the 1830s or 1840s had not farmed them, typically because they had neither tools nor proper irrigation in order to do it. But those lands essentially will be confiscated and then sold. In some cases, you'll have speculators who will go out and buy land from individual native peoples for sale. But this Indian land for sale notice, this one's from about 1907, 1910, it was yet another time where we see white settlement and encroachment upon land that had been set aside long ago for native people. Note for something we'll see in Unit 7, much of this land, once whites settle upon it, it will be over-farmed. And by 1930, it will create the environmental disaster of the Dust Bowl. So I spoke a little while ago of the conflict between Native people and the U.S. military, and its conclusion in 1890. The last time we will see what is purported to be armed resistance by Native people against the U.S. government will be somewhere called Wounded Knee in South Dakota in 1890. And it's a very, very sad story in that many of the Native people who had attempted to not live on the reservation system after it began to be created in the West in the 1850s, certainly by 1887 with the Dawes Act, we still have a few thousand Native people who want to continue to be nomadic, don't want to live on the reservation. But the winter of 1889, 1890 was incredibly harsh, very cold, lots of snowfall. And the sort of the last group of Sioux Indian who had tried to stay nomadic attempt to turn themselves in. They go back to the Great Sioux Reservation and attempt to find a place, if nothing else, food and shelter for the winter. In order to live on the reservation, of the many rules, one of them was that Native people could not have firearms. And as these nearly 1,000 Native people had arrived at Wounded Knee, they were searched for weapons. And it's unclear whether it was an older Native person who was deaf and was refusing to hand over his weapon, if it might have been a person from the U.S. military who had inadvertently discharged their weapon. But shots were fired, and in the end, more than 300 Native people were killed. The U.S. government at the time referred to it as the Battle of Wounded Knee. That connotes that you have two sides that are equally armed and prepared for battle, and that certainly was not the case, but it is the last time that you will see any attempt at armed resistance against the U.S. military in the West. So the frontier settlements we see here on our map, it's important to look at them by date. So if we're looking at them in terms of decade, our teal green here, you can see that the East is pretty well settled by 1870, and obviously the coastal areas of Oregon and California, where you see interior settlement in California, this will be due to the gold rush, where you see slightly interior settlement in Washington and Oregon, will be a result of people traveling on that Oregon Trail in an earlier period. Orange, we see settlement by 1880, the pink 1890. And obviously, there's all of this white on our screen here. So these are areas that aren't settled. But again, it's important to note that where people settle and when they settle is contingent on a couple of things. One is a motivation to go out west. And so in places like Colorado, this teal to orange to pink area in Nevada, there will be something called the Comstock lode, a great silver strike that'll be found there in the 1870s. What we see here in Utah and Montana, again, gold and silver strikes that'll be found in the 1870s and 1880s. South Dakota, again, the 1880s and 1890s, we'll see tremendous settlement. And then also what ultimately would have been the path of the Transcontinental Railroad and its subsequent lines. So as the railroad's built, we see a decimation of the buffalo, but we also see that wherever there would have been station stops, whites would have not wished to see Native people. And so you will see essentially these areas that aren't settled are going to become the areas where we see Native reservations begin. By 1890, the Census Bureau is going to say that the frontier has officially closed. So again, it's this idea that I can go to the 49th parallel, the northern border of the United States, and I can drop directly south, and over the course of that 1,200-mile drop, by 1890, there is no continuous line of recession. That at least at some point on that line, there is permanent white settlement. that frontier being closed, we talked about what that'll mean psychically for Americans, right? We talked about the frontier thesis. But certainly up through about 1900, culturally, people were encouraged to settle west, that, again, this idea of manifest destiny, that this land had been given to the American people. It was a place of opportunity and prosperity. Assimilation programs for Native people will continue on well until the 1920s. By 1924, the United States government is going to do all kinds of things to define citizenship, primarily motivated about dealing and limiting the amount of immigration that's coming from Central and Eastern Europe at the beginnings of the 20th century. But at the same time, where citizenship is being defined and immigration is being restricted, the US government will finally say that Indians are also citizens as well, but not until 1924. So indigenous people in the United States will become citizens, and their sovereignty will be recognized only in terms of Congress and whatever decisions Congress makes about the reservation system. We still end up talking about the reservation system, certainly what it means to be an indigenous person in the United States to this day, and not to get into too much about the legal background, but just recently, in the summer of 2020, the United States Supreme Court did make a decision in McGirt v. Oklahoma, in which they said that these lands of the Cherokee Nation, the Muskogee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Seminole, that these lands had not technically been disestablished by the Curtis Act. And that these lands, at least legally, unless Congress changes something, actually belong to these Native people, and the laws of the state of Oklahoma and the federal government may not apply. And so that's going to be something that Congress and the state of Oklahoma are going to continue to have to work through over the next few years. In recent news, with the new administration that'll be coming in January, there will be new heads of the various departments. And the Department of the Interior, the person who's been nominated, her name is Deb Haaland, and she is from New Mexico. She will be the first indigenous person to potentially be the head of a U.S. cabinet position. And it's kind of an interesting thing to think about in terms of environmental issues, land usage, that potentially you'll have someone who is connected truly to the indigenous people of the United States, and how that might shape policy and outlook when it comes to the land of the United States. So as we finish up today, just to take us back to where we started, when we spoke about the conquest of the West, again, that is certainly the point of view of indigenous people, right? We can see this picture here that demonstrates the work of the Carlisle Indian schools and the movement that begins with the Dawes Act to essentially reshape Indian culture in the United States. And that's where we want to be looking at as we go through our activity today, is looking at which policies, what viewpoints are those of the United States government and its citizens, and the viewpoints of people who were the Plains Indians, the indigenous people of the West, and how that conflict plays out, and why we see just within a short period of time the containment and restraining of Native people in that window of time between 1860 and 1900.